Welcome to Winter Grace Senior Ministries. I am Debbie Bergio, and I am so excited to introduce to you Dr. Amy Hanson. She is the author of Baby Boomers and Beyond. I was first, quote unquote, met Amy when I was writing my thesis in seminary, and I'm just thrilled to have you here with us today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
We are going to be talking about ministry with, for, by boomers and beyond. And how did you, I know you've been in this line of work for a good while now. How did you get started?
Yes, I always kind of had a leaning towards wanting to work or serve with older adults, and so I volunteered even in like a nursing home setting in high school and began to gear my studies that way. In school, was interested in ministry, but then also ministry with older people, and that was 25 years ago now, when we had some churches that had senior adult ministry. And probably 10 or even 15 years ago now, I started focusing in a little more on the baby boomer, knowing that this group was a huge group of people. 78 million is the number usually attached to baby boomers, and that they were going to be approaching aging kind of in a different way than the preceding generation. And so personally, I've worked in a church staff in the past as an older adult, like ministry director, and then I've done some writing, like the book you mentioned, but also some traveling, speaking to help churches mainly, sometimes organizations too, but churches mainly think about how to reach and engage older adults. Because I think it's kind of like the cutting edge, exciting area right now where lots of good things can happen.
Absolutely. I mean, 78 million is a huge percentage of our population. People are living so much longer now than they did just even 30 years ago. And baby boomers have had a different approach to life than the generation preceding them in every way. So why wouldn't aging be different?
Right, exactly. The generation, usually I define the baby boomers being born between 1946 to 1964. And so the generation before that are sometimes referred to as the builders, like, those who built the country. Sometimes you'll see the term like silent generation. And we are seeing differences. When you think about boomers, they were a big group because the parents came home from the war and we had a boom in the population. And then as that generation has kind of traveled through, they made changes like in schools. We needed more schools to accommodate them. And boomers have always kind of had that willingness to question authority, whether that be, even during the Vietnam War era or things like that. And so they've also always been activists and wanted to make a difference. And so to bring us up to speed right now, here's these folks kind of marching into the retirement season, and they don't want to necessarily slow down or maybe slow down in the same way that they feel like their parents or the generation before did. Many of them are working longer. Some of them are like retiring from their, main job and now going into something else that's maybe in a little more of a helping profession or just things like that. It's a group that's kind of denying aging. Some of them don't like the word senior. Maybe some people watching this, they don't always like to be called senior. And I just think we want to kind of reach out to these folks and engage them as best we can.
So coming from the perspective of ministry, why do you see it as important to reach out in a different way, or maybe reach out in a more, I can't think of the word, intentional way?
Because they're, how would I maybe say this? A lot of older adult ministries in the past have had a very fellowship or kind of social model. And there's nothing wrong with that. It really, there are those needs, I think, for every season of our life. We need connection with other people. But even in our later years, we've maybe experienced a lot of loss, and And so churches, along with other groups, really began to emphasize kind of that social component, to have a luncheon and a program or something like that. And all of that's been good. And yet the baby boomers today, for one thing, they're not necessarily responding to those same activities. They maybe don't want to have the lunch and hear the barbershop quartet or whatever we might think of.
Right.
So that's one thing. And then two, whether or not somebody's a baby boomer or even older, inside all of us is kind of this need and desire to have purpose, have a reason to get up in the morning. And people, if I think sometimes if we can have one-on-one conversation with folks, you'll hear people say, this retirement isn't all that I thought it would be, or yeah. And boomers especially, I think, we have this time, we're living so much longer. So how do we help them be a good steward of this time right now that God's given them?
Absolutely. You write in your book about some of the myths of aging, and I know that sometimes that keeps people from getting involved too. So what are some of those myths that might be holding us back?
Yeah, some of these are stereotypes that we, even if we're older, buy into, or some people that are, like working in an organization or a family or whatever. So here's a few, like older adults can't learn new things. That would be false. In the absence of disease, we can continue to learn new things. We can make new connections in our brain. Now, of course, if we've been affected by like Alzheimer's disease or stroke, then that's kind of a different thing. But we are able to learn new things. Now, as we get older, we don't learn as quickly. So it may take us, longer to make those new connections, more practice, more effort. One thing I like to kind of keep in mind, we've all heard people say, maybe we've even said it, oh, I'm too old to learn that. But really that has a lot to do with our motivation. And I think about that even during this time with the pandemic and all of the, coronavirus. There were many older adults who had felt like, I can't learn technology. I can't learn how to use Zoom or the computer. But then when this stuff started happening, it became much more motivating to learn how to do it. And I hear that all the time, from grandparents or great grandparents who, I've learned how to text because that's the way I can communicate with my grandkids. And so learning has a lot to do with motivation. And I think that we got to remember we can learn new stuff, and that can play into us getting engaged in new volunteer opportunities that we can learn it. Another myth I think would be older people can't change. Now, all of us know somebody who we feel like, she's very stuck in her ways. But change has more to do with our temperament or our personality, right? If it was a little bit harder for us when we're younger, it might be harder when we're older. But I think we got to be careful with that, because that can put limits on things. If we think, well, they couldn't change, then we start limiting God, what he can do in somebody's life. He's all about bringing about new things and change. And so I think that's a myth that we sometimes buy into. Chronological age is the most important determinant of age.
Yeah.
And, that's just that number, right? Chronological age is what our birth certificate says. And yet lots of things have happened. Or people, like Webster compiled his dictionary, like when he was 70 and making revisions into the 80s, or Socrates, writing a philosophy in his 70s, or, lots of wonderful biblical examples of, Moses leading the Israelites when he was 80, or the Apostle John writing the book of Revelation, most think when he was in his 90s. So, we can't let that number kind of derail us. That's just a number. And those things, they're important because they could affect us getting involved with stuff if we buy into those myths.
Absolutely. And I think absolutely true. I mean, some of the things she said make me think of my mother-in-law. She's 85. She is on the go all the time. Just taught her how to use Zoom on the iPad last week because her 80-year-old sister was coming to town and they needed to have her to be able to be on a meeting. But it was like, okay, this is what we need to learn how to do. Show me how to do it. So it was, so she's our hero. Has this aging thing. Yeah.
I've heard other stories like that with, especially during this time frame.
Mm.
You know, an 80-year-old woman who was still tutoring like children who needed help, or even middle schoolers help with math. But then the pandemic stuff happened, and she learned how to do it, you know, over Zoom, so she could keep helping those kids, which is great. I mean, that's what we want to do.
That is great. So okay, so tutoring, that might be something like a long-term thing. Is that a good, when you're looking at it from a church perspective, trying to encourage churches to build their ministry, I don't know, attracting boomers to be part of what they're doing in their churches? What are some maybe good guidelines or ideas for encouraging boomers to join in?
Well, I think one of the, you know, important things for us to think about, especially if you're like in a church setting wanting to kind of minister with this age group, is to really kind of do a lot of it based on getting them involved in serving. So, you know, engaging them in something meaningful. And sometimes we make the mistake, you know, in organizations and in churches, well, they're retired, they can come in and fold the newsletter. Of course, those are all electronic now, or staple the mailer that's going to go out, and there's nothing wrong with that. You know, they can come make the coffee, but I think it just limits so much what, you know, folks can do at this season in their life. So, you know, churches can help by helping people tap into what their passion is. You know, I like to ask older adults, you know, what's something you've always wanted to do, but you haven't had the opportunity to do? I mean, thinking about, you know, interests that they have. If money wasn't an issue or time wasn't an issue, and letting them kind of dream again at this season that maybe there's something they could, you know, do at this time in their life. Keeping them connected to God. You know, He's really who points us to our different places of serving and being engaged. It makes me think of this man I met. He was in his late 70s when I met him, and he was volunteering in the Houston, Texas prison system. And he said what got him into that was he had been at church, and the pastor was teaching from Matthew 25, where it says, you know, when I was sick, you came to visit me, or when I was in prison, you came to see me. And he said it resonated, so he got trained to start volunteering in the prisons. And, you know, I meet him and he's like 78, and I kind of am like, how are you going to keep doing this? You know, this can't be safe for a older guy, you know, just to kind of see. And he, you know, he just about jumped out of the chair. He knew the statistics, you know, he knew the statistics. And he said there was a 92-year-old man who came to the prison, and if he could do it, I can do it. And I just think, you know, a couple things with that. You know, he had kind of found his passion or sweet spot at that time in his life. You know, so it was maybe it hadn't been his whole life, but during that time. And he also had been, you know, listening to God, praying about it. And leaders, we can help people do that, right? We can help them think about what those things are, connect them to God, get them considering some of those things. Yeah, I think that's important.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. You know, we have, you know, people have been working their whole lives, or for pay or not for pay, and they've developed skills and talents, and now they can use those skills and talents maybe in a different way or a new way that they weren't able to do before, didn't have the opportunity to before.
That's so true. I think there's been some research that says boomer men especially want to know, how can I use my skills from work now in a different, you know, venue or a different way? Of course, some people, they don't want it to have anything to do with what they did when they were working, you know.
That's true too. That's absolutely true.
Everybody's an individual for sure. Yeah.
And that's that. I mean, I think that's a huge point. Everyone's an individual, and we can't have a cookie cutter, one size fits all kind of outlook based on someone's age or ministering with them. And I think that's a really good point. So we're talking about retirement, and people retire. This whole idea of retirement isn't really biblical, is it? We don't get to retire from being disciple.
So I used to even say, well, retirement's never mentioned in the Bible, but I was wrong, because there's a passage in Numbers, the Old Testament, Numbers chapter 8, where it's talking about the priests, and the instructions are that, they could retire at 50, but they're supposed to, or not supposed to, it says, but they can come alongside their brothers, or some versions will say mentor them. And most of the thought around that is, that was the tabernacle, the temple, and there were all those things that had to be carried. And so there's physical labor. Commentators will say there's physical labor involved with that. And so, they maybe encourage that retirement, but they were to come alongside and mentor. But there is some research in science about leafcutter ants, little ants. And yeah, so I guess they have, sharp mandible blades that cut through the leaves. And what they're finding is that when those razor blade like teeth aren't sharp anymore, then those particular ants are moved to a different role in the colony. They often start carrying the leaves. And I feel like if God has this, different role for ants, we have to believe that even though one part of us, one thing may change. We may not be in this work environment or involved in this particular ministry, or just like I was saying about the priests in the Old Testament, they weren't to do this particular work, but they were to now mentor or come alongside. I think that's just true for all of us. Just like you were saying, it doesn't say anywhere in scripture where we just get to kind of like now live a life of leisure and focus on ourselves. Our calling may change, but he has something for us, right? Something till we take our last breath.
Yeah, I think it's very realistic to think our callings change. We have different stages and different seasons, and there isn't any reason why that can't change. We're all focused on serving God, but in different ways.
Yeah, for sure.
So Amy, you are a professor also. So can you tell us, you're a gerontology professor?
Yeah. Correct? So I teach at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and gerontology is the study of aging, but from a more multidisciplinary perspective. It's not just the medical focus of that. And yeah, so it kind of allows me to be with students and try to get them excited about aging, and keeps me in the literature reading some about it, and that's all good and fun.
I like when you talk about being a multidisciplinary subject, because I think ministering with older adults, it's not multidisciplinary, but we're not just focused on discipleship, of course, but the whole person. God created the whole person, and I was thinking about that multi-pronged approach to
kind of the whole person. And even if you think about aging well or successful aging, when you study that or read about it, those are those different components. Our physical body. I mean, that's often what we think of, but it's also our mind, and as we look at scripture, our soul. I mean, all those different aspects of ourselves, our passions, our life experiences. That's so much of what I think older people, boomers and older adults, kind of bring is life experience. And that includes the difficult life experiences, the crises and the family challenges, because, God won't waste those things if we'll allow him to use it. So sometimes I like to kind of say there's this equation, people in that later half of life have time. And, I know a lot of people who are retired, they are busier now than when they were working, but we do reach a point where we have a little more discretionary time, we're getting to make our choices. So time plus experience, like I was talking about, plus resources. Those might be financial, but they might just be things we have, like, our home that used to maybe is a large home, and we have a little mother-in-law quarters. I heard of a dentist who had that, and then they started using it for missionaries, to stay there. Whatever it is, time plus experience plus resources, I think, equals this opportunity for significant kingdom impact, the kind of impact that people can make at this stage, as these later years of their life. And that's really what I believe. I think maybe this may be some of the time, these later years, when we do our biggest stuff for God, for the community. And I don't want us to miss that because we believe the myths, or because we think, well, I should let the younger ones do it now, or any of those any of those kind of things.
I love that equation. Time plus experience plus resources.
Resources. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Equals impact, right?
Yeah. Impact, absolutely. I love that. I mean, I'm a math kind of geek, so talk about equations. I'm there.
Good, because I'm not much of a math.
That was in a different season, though. This is a definitely different season. So, Amy, thank you so much I'm so glad to meet you, get to meet you, and thank you for being a part of our event. I'm really happy to share you with our audience here in most likely the greater Baltimore, Washington area, and hopefully that region and maybe even beyond. So just thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. Thanks for doing what you're doing.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you. It's my second season or third season or whatever season. haven't counted those. So, yeah. Well, thanks. Have a wonderful day.
You too.